Hey guys, tonight we're pulling up a chair at the most gloriously unhinged dinner table in American history. We're talking about the Gilded Age, that glistening gold-plated era between the 1870s and 1900s, when a handful of Americans had so much money they genuinely ran out of reasonable things to do with it. And what do humans do when they have too much money and not enough problems? They eat. Elaborately, absurdly, sometimes fatally. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always somehow 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. And if you prefer your history served up as audio, the channel is now live on Spotify, links in the description. Now go ahead and dim those lights, flip on a fan for some soft background noise and get yourself properly horizontal. You deserve it. Let's set the scene for a moment. The Gilded Age was a time when men named Vanderbilt, Astor and Carnegie were accumulating wealth so staggering it would make a modern hedge fund manager feel slightly embarrassed. These were people who built 70-room summer cottages and called them cottages without a single trace of irony. And at the centre of all this excess, at the very heart of how the ultra-rich announced their dominance over the natural world and common sense alike, was food. Not just food, spectacle, theatre, competitive eating, but make it formal. Have you ever wondered what people with truly obscene amounts of money decided to put in their mouths? Did they eat things that would make a modern food critic faint? Or things that would make a modern food critic quit in protest? Were there actual gold flakes on the food? Or was that just a rumour started by someone who had already eaten too much turtle soup? What was it like to sit at a dinner table where the centerpiece was a live animal and the soup course alone lasted 45 minutes? Could you survive a 12-course Gilded Age dinner without losing consciousness, or your dignity, or both? And what exactly happened at the dinner party where guests ate off the backs of horses? Congratulations, you've just woken up at 1885. You're somewhere in Manhattan, and someone is handing you a menu the size of a small dictionary. The wine is French, the oysters are still alive, and the man across from you just spent $600 on a single dinner for his dog. Welcome to the Gilded Age. Try not to make eye contact with the swan. Let's start at the beginning, or rather, at the first course, then the second, then the 3rd through 12th. Because in Gilded Age America, dinner was not a meal, it was a cardiovascular event. The formal dinner of the 1880s and 90s was structured around what the French called service à la Russe, a style of dining where courses were brought out one at a time in a specific sequence rather than all at once. The American upper class adopted this with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for things that are unnecessary but feel extremely important. And before you picture something elegant and refined, let's be honest about what 12 courses actually means in practice. It means you sat down at 7 in the evening and did not see the outside world again until 11. It means you ate oysters, then soup, then fish, then a sorbet to reset your stomach, then a roast, then game, then vegetables, then a cold dish, then hot pudding, then ices, then fruit, then cheese, then coffee. And that was considered modest. For occasions of genuine social significance, there were additional courses tucked between existing courses, the way a persistent relative is tucked between you and the exit at a family gathering. You did not see them coming. You could not avoid them. You simply ate them and carried on. The white-gloved servants who managed all of this had been trained to move through the room like well-dressed ghosts. They poured wine without making eye contact, removed plates without rattling them, and replaced silverware so smoothly that you might not notice until you looked down and found yourself holding a fork you had not reached for. Every course came with its own china, its own glass, its own correct implementation. By the end of the evening, a single guest's place setting had cycled through enough tableware to stock a medium-sized kitchen. The dishwashing situation the morning after a grand Gilded Age dinner was, by all accounts, a humbling domestic landscape. The quantities were not what you would describe as restrained. These were not tasting portions. A guest at a dinner hosted by one of the Newport elite might begin with 24 oysters, and consider this a reasonable opening position. The soup that followed was not a cup. It was a bowl, full, hot, and served with bread. The fish course was an actual serving of fish. The roast was a roast. By the time the game arrived, usually a bird of some kind shot by someone with enough land to shoot things on, many guests had entered a state that can only be described as committed. You were in it now. The only direction was forward, into the vegetables through the cold dish, past the pudding, and out the other side into dessert, which was its own sustained act of endurance. Wine, of course, ran throughout. A different glass accompanied each course. Sherry with the soup, white burgundy with the fish, red Bordeaux with the roast, Sauterne with the dessert, and champagne operating more or less continuously as ambient soundtrack to the whole event. By the time coffee arrived, guests were not simply full, they were complete, finished, achieved. The carriage ride home was warm and quiet and conducted entirely in a pleasant fog of cream sauce and Bordeaux. What made this a competitive sport rather than simply an indulgent meal was the social stakes attached to every decision. What you served, in what order, on what china, with what wine, with how many servants, with what flowers, with what printed menu card at each place, all of it was observed, noted, discussed, and compared. A hostess who got it right earned the quiet, devastating approval of her peers. A hostess who got it wrong would not hear about it directly. She would simply notice, over the following weeks, that certain invitations stopped arriving. The 12-course dinner was not just food, it was an examination, and everyone in the room was both student and examiner. If the Gilded Age had a signature dish, something that said we have arrived, we are wealthy, and we have strong opinions about reptiles, it was terrapin soup. Specifically Diamondback terrapin, a small saltwater turtle native to the Atlantic coast, and the single most fashionable thing you could put in a bowl between roughly 1870 and 1910. Diamondback terrapin was not cheap. It was, at various points, one of the most expensive ingredients in American cuisine, and the people who served it knew this and wanted you to know it too. A single turtle could cost several dollars at a time, when a working man's weekly wage hovered somewhere in the same range. An entire pot of terrapin soup, made properly with cream, sherry, hard-boiled eggs, butter, and the carefully extracted meat of multiple turtles, represented a financial commitment that most Americans would have considered somewhere between impressive and deranged. The host who served it considered it neither. They considered it appropriate. The preparation was elaborate in ways that modern cooking rarely attempts. The turtles were kept alive until they were needed, which meant that the kitchens of fashionable households contained, somewhere below stairs, a collection of diamondback terrapins waiting in tanks with the patient resignation of creatures who had not yet been told what was happening. They were then prepared through a multi-step process involving blanching, careful extraction of the meat, and a sauce of such richness that contemporary accounts describe grown men briefly losing the ability to form sentences after the first few spoonfuls. This was considered a point in the dish's favour. The eggs, when present inside the female turtles, were left in the finished soup as a sign of quality. This detail appears in recipe after recipe from the period with a matter-of-factness that suggests it was entirely normal, which in context it was. You were not just eating soup, you were eating a statement. The statement was, I have sourced a living animal, had it prepared by a skilled kitchen, and I'm now serving you the most expensive bowl of anything currently available in the continental United States. You are welcome. Terrapin soup appeared on menus at the finest hotels and at presidential state dinners with a regularity that suggests certain presidents had personal feelings. about the dish. Hotels in Baltimore and Philadelphia competed openly over whose preparation was superior, a rivalry conducted in the press and in the dining rooms of the wealthy, with an intensity that seems, at this distance, somewhat disproportionate to the subject matter. It was soup. It was very good soup. But it was also an identity, a declaration, a membership card to a specific stratum of American life that most people would never enter. The ecological consequences of this enthusiasm were predictable and significant. Diamondback terrapin populations along the eastern seaboard declined sharply over the course of this period. By the early 20th century, conservationists were noting the disappearance with alarm. The response from fashionable dining circles was, initially, to pay more for what remained, which is the kind of problem-solving approach that explains how the situation developed in the first place. Eventually, changing tastes and genuine scarcity combined to remove terrapin from the fashionable menu entirely. The dish faded from American fine dining, leaving behind depleted coastal populations and a lot of very good silver soup tureens in need of new purpose. Fashion, it turns out, is not always good for wildlife. The turtles would probably like that noted. Now we arrive at what is possibly the single most surreal event in the history of American entertaining, and the bar for that title is, as you are about to discover, extremely high. In 1903, a man named C.K.G. Billings hosted a dinner at Sherry's, one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants, to celebrate the opening of his new stable. And he decided the appropriate way to celebrate a stable was to bring the stable to dinner. 36 guests arrived at Sherry's expecting, presumably, a restaurant. What they found was a transformed dining room where the floor had been covered in sod and artificial turf, where the air carried the specific quality of an indoor pasture, and where 36 horses stood waiting with the quiet dignity of animals who had been told this was a normal Tuesday. Each guest was helped onto a horse, a small tray was attached to each saddle, and dinner was served, on horseback, in a restaurant in Manhattan. At a table where, the week before, people had eaten oysters in evening clothes like civilized human beings. The waiters, dressed in hunting attire that matched the equestrian theme, navigated what was essentially a temporary indoor pasture carrying trays of food through the specific challenge of a room full of horses and formally dressed people sitting on top of them. The champagne was served in small bags that hung from the saddle like feed bags, which meant the experience of dining at one of New York's finest establishments was, physically speaking, not entirely unlike being a horse yourself. The guests ate. The horses stood. Everyone was, by all accounts, very well behaved, though the horses had considerably less choice in the matter. The cost was approximately $45 per person, which in 1903 represented a sum a working-class New Yorker might spend on food for several months. Newspapers covered it with breathless, outraged fascination. Editorial writers demanded to know whether this was appropriate. Society columnists described the floral arrangements. Both readerships grew. This is the media economy of the Gilded Age in miniature. Scandal and admiration occupying the same column, sometimes the same sentence, and both selling papers. What is remarkable about the dinner on horseback is not just the spectacle, but the logic behind it, which follows, if you accept its premises, a kind of internal consistency. Billings had a new stable. He was proud of it. He wanted to celebrate it. He wanted his guests to share in the celebration in a way that was memorable, connected to the occasion, and demonstrated a willingness to spend money in ways that ordinary people would never consider. All of these goals were achieved. The dinner was remembered. It is still being described more than a century later. By the standards of Gilded Age entertaining, it was an unambiguous success. The horses, for what it is worth, were trained carriage animals accustomed to the presence of people, and the particular social pressures of New York life. Even so, one imagines they had questions about the evening. The sod on the floor of a Manhattan restaurant, the electric lights, the smell of cream sauce mixing with hay, the formally dressed people sitting on their backs eating from small attached trays. If horses keep records, this one was probably noted, not with judgment, just with the quiet, wondering attention of a creature who has seen a great deal and has learned that humans, given sufficient money and freedom from consequence, will do almost anything and call it a party. Speaking of topping things. In the 1890s, a man in New York hosted a dinner for his dog. Not a small gesture, not a dog biscuit on a nice plate. A dinner, a formal dinner with a guest list of other dogs, complete with place settings scaled appropriately for the canine form, and a budget that would have kept a working-class family comfortable for the better part of a year. The host reportedly spent $600 on the event, which translates to somewhere in the range of $20,000 today, depending on the calculation you use and how much you want the number to affect you. The dogs received a menu. They wore ribbons. They were served from China. The other dogs in attendance arrived accompanied by their owners, who sat at the edges of the room watching with the expressions of people who had made a series of decisions that led them to this moment and were no longer certain how to evaluate those decisions. Whether any of the dogs appreciated the gesture is a matter of genuine philosophical uncertainty. What dogs primarily appreciate is smell, proximity to food, and the absence of sudden loud noises, all of which were present at the dinner. Whether they appreciated the china is harder to say. Whether they appreciated the menu, printed in the same French-influenced style as the most fashionable human dinners of the era, is almost certainly no. But the menu was there nonetheless, because the point was not what the dogs experienced. The point was what the humans watching experienced. The scale of it. The audacity of spending $600 on a dinner for animals while half the city was sleeping 4 to a room and eating yesterday's bread. This was not an isolated eccentricity. The Gilded Age produced a small but committed genre of elaborate animal hospitality that extended well beyond the famous dog dinner. There were dinner parties thrown for cats, conducted with similar ceremony. There were banquets celebrating horses. There were reportedly gatherings in Newport where monkeys were seated at table and served alongside human guests, which raises questions about the seating chart and the clean-up that history declines to fully answer. One account describes a dinner party where the guest of honour was a pet goat wearing a flower crown. This was considered charming. The common thread was the specific dynamic of Gilded Age social competition, which operated on a principle of continuous escalation. Once ordinary extravagance had ceased to impress anyone, once a 12-course dinner was simply what you served on a Tuesday, you had to find new territory. Hosting a formal dinner for your retriever was new territory. It generated conversation. It generated newspaper coverage. It generated the social currency of being the person who did that. And in an environment where social currency was the primary goal of almost every social act, being the person who did that was worth $600. What strikes a modern observer most sharply is not the cost but the context. The same island that contained the mansions of Fifth Avenue contained the tenements of the Lower East Side where families lived in genuine privation. The dog eating from China at a $600 dinner was, by the measures that matter to dogs, probably not better off than any other well-fed pet. But as a symbol of what money could do and what it chose to do, the dog dinner was clarifying. It said, "We have so much that we have run out of reasonable ways to spend it. That, perhaps more than any 12-course menu or horseback dinner, is what the Gilded Age was really serving." If food was theatre in the Gilded Age, then decoration was the stage, and some hosts were not content to simply set a pretty table. They wanted the table to be a statement. They wanted every guest who sat down to understand within 30 seconds of arriving that they were in the presence of someone who had thought very hard about this room and had the resources to execute those thoughts without compromise or hesitation. Enter the Novelty centerpiece. Gilded Age dinner tables were decorated with elaborate floral arrangements that could cost more than a week's wages for the florist who assembled them. Living birds in gilded cages provided ambient sound and theatrical energy that regular centerpieces could not match. Working fountains appeared on dining room tables at parties where the host had decided that controlled water was an appropriate decorative element. Tableaux involving moss, mirrors, and sculptural flowers created landscapes guests were expected to admire before being seated and somehow ignore for the next 4 hours. At one famous dinner, a full-scale sand sculpture representing a scene from classical mythology occupied the centre of the table, requiring its own structural support and presumably a great deal of sand, which raises practical questions that the historical record declines to answer. But the most extraordinary decorative trend, the one that most precisely captures the Gilded Age spirit of spending money in ways that are visible rather than useful, was the use of actual precious metals in the dining experience. Some hosts served desserts dusted with real gold leaf, not gold flavouring, not gold colouring, not anything that contributed to the taste of the meringue or the mousse in question. Actual gold, applied because the implication that your guests were literally eating money was considered an elegant aesthetic choice. Chocolates were painted with gold. Cake decorations were gilded. The edible gold trend operated on a logic that was perfectly circular. Gold was used because it was expensive. It was expensive because it was gold, and using it demonstrated a willingness to spend money on things that served no practical purpose, which was itself the purpose. Party favours followed the same logic with even less restraint. A gift left at each place setting might be made of solid silver, sometimes solid gold. Commemorative spoons, small boxes, miniature objects of no utility but clear and obvious expense were distributed to guests as though the 12-course dinner and the wine and the entertainment had not been quite sufficient to communicate the point. At certain dinners, the cigarettes offered after the meal were reportedly wrapped in currency. Whether this was literally true or whether it was the kind of rumour that circulates because it is exactly what one can imagine these people doing is difficult to verify. What is clear is that it was considered entirely plausible, that people repeated it without scepticism, and that in repeating it they were expressing not surprise but recognition. Of course someone did that. That sounds exactly right. The gold and silver dinner produced a specific kind of social memory. Guests talked about it afterward, not primarily because the food was extraordinary, though it often was, but because the experience of eating gold, of taking home a solid silver spoon, of sitting at a table where the centerpiece moved and the fountain ran and the candles reflected, in mirror after mirror created a sensory impression of abundance so complete that it was difficult to describe without sounding fabricated, which, in a way, was the whole point. The Gilded Age table was designed to be indescribable, and then its guests described it constantly to everyone they met for weeks afterward. This was not a side effect. It was the strategy. No account of Gilded Age food is complete without a proper introduction to the institution that made so much of it possible. Delmonico's restaurant, which operated in various locations in Manhattan from 1837 through 1923, and which functioned during its prime as something between a temple, a social club, and a very compelling argument for moving to New York immediately and staying there permanently. Delmonico's was the place where American fine dining effectively invented itself, which is a significant claim, and also, by most serial accounts of culinary history, essentially accurate. It was where Lobster Newburgh was created, reportedly because a sea captain named Ben Wenberg brought the recipe to the chef, and then had a falling out with management, causing the dish to be renamed from Wenberg to Newburgh, in a petty but permanent act of passive-aggressive culinary revenge. It was where eggs Benedict were either invented or so thoroughly popularized that the distinction ceased to matter. It was where the wealthiest people in America went to see each other, to be seen, to confirm their position, and to eat in ways that required advanced planning, the correct coat, and a willingness to pace yourself through soup. The physical space of Delmonico's was itself a social instrument. The dining room was designed to be beautiful enough to impress without being so theatrical as to distract from the primary business of being seen eating there. Tables were positioned to maximize the possibility of being noticed by the right people while maintaining the fiction that you had not, particularly, tried to be noticed. The waiters recognized regulars, remembered preferences, and managed the specific social complexity of a room where every person was conducting at least 2 conversations simultaneously, one with their table companion and one with the room at large. Chefs at Delmonico's were treated with reverence usually reserved for architects or surgeons. Charles Ranhofer, who served as head chef for nearly 3 decades, published a cookbook of almost 1,000 pages that read, "Less like a recipe collection and more like a declaration of what food could be when money, skill, and ambition combined without restraint." The recipes called for truffles in quantities suggesting an intimate personal relationship with the truffle trade. Lobster appeared in preparations of extraordinary complexity. Cream was used with a generosity that the 19th century had not yet been advised to reconsider. Private dinners at Delmonico's, where wealthy hosts rented out the upper, floors for events combining food, music, dancing, and social maneuvering, were the apex of fashionable entertaining. Ward McAllister, the self-appointed shepherd of New York society, held court here and used the setting to conduct the business of deciding who mattered and who did not, which was apparently a full-time occupation requiring considerable dedication. If you were invited to dinner at Delmonico's by the right person, your social position was confirmed. If the right person did not invite you, you knew. The not being invited was itself information, delivered without words and received without the possibility of misunderstanding. Delmonico's was, in this sense, not just a restaurant. It was a verdict, and it was issued nightly in courses. Here is a fact about American food history that tends to produce a specific expression on people's faces when they hear it. In the early 19th century, lobster was considered poor people's food. Not inexpensive, but acceptable poor. People's food. Actually poor people's food. Used as fish bait, fed to prisoners, and served to servants in quantity so generous that some household contracts apparently specified limits on how frequently lobster could appear in the staff dining room, because even people with no other options had a threshold. The northeastern coast of America in the early 1800s was so densely populated with lobster that the creatures washed up on beaches in piles following storms. Coastal residents used them as fertilizer. Fishermen used them as bait. Children collected them at low tide with the casual indifference of people gathering something that is everywhere and costs nothing. The idea that this particular animal would one day require a reservation and a credit card with available balance would have struck the average 1820 New Englander as somewhere between confused and insulting. By the Gilded Age, all of this had changed completely. Lobster was fashionable. Lobster was prestigious. Lobster appeared at Delmonico's in cream sauce and showed up on the menus of the finest hotels with the confident frequency of an ingredient that had decided its past was entirely behind it. What had changed was not the lobster. The lobster was the same animal it had always been, with the same flavour and the same general personality. What had changed was scarcity, transportation, and the social logic of the Gilded Age, which held that if something could be made expensive and associated with refinement, it would be made expensive and associated with refinement, regardless of its prior history or its prior associations with prison meals. The oyster travelled the same road in the opposite direction, which makes the two stories taken together a useful illustration of how food status works in practice. Oysters began the century as a luxury item, then became so thoroughly associated with working-class New York life by the mid-1800s that oyster carts lined the streets, and a dozen could be had for a few cents while standing on the sidewalk. Then the upper class decided oysters were refined again, and the price adjusted upward accordingly. Gilded Age oysters were consumed in quantities that would prompt a concerned conversation today. 24 at a sitting as an opening course was not unusual at fashionable dinners. They were served raw, fried, in chowder, in stuffing, in patties, and on the half shell with accompaniments that were themselves carefully considered. The oyster had become, by the 1880s, a symbol of the particular Gilded Age contradiction. Something once democratic, made exclusive by wealth and fashion, served at prices that kept it out of reach of the people who had eaten it cheaply a generation before. The lobster followed the same arc. Both animals remained unchanged. The humans around them changed the rules, as humans always do, and called the result civilization. To understand Gilded Age food culture, you have to understand Ward McAllister, because Ward McAllister understood Gilded Age food culture better than almost anyone alive, was deeply committed to making sure everyone else knew it, and spent the better part of 3 decades applying that understanding to the project of deciding which Americans were socially acceptable and which ones were not, a project he pursued with the focused dedication of a man who had found his calling and intended to honour it fully. McAllister was Georgia-born, which gave him a certain outsider's hunger for the kind of established social acceptance that New York's older families wore without apparent effort. He spent years in Europe studying the entertaining customs of the English and French aristocracy, and returned to America with the specific energy of someone who had seen how things should be done and found the local version inadequate. He attached himself to Caroline Astor, widely considered the defining social authority of New York's upper class, and together they constructed a system of social precedents so elaborate, so internally consistent, and so ruthlessly enforced that it would not have looked out of place in a royal court. It looked, in fact, quite a lot like a royal court. That was entirely the intention. At the centre of this system was the dinner party, which McAllister treated not as a social occasion, but as an act of civilization requiring careful management. He wrote at considerable length about how a proper dinner should be conducted, what should be served in what order, with what wines, by how many servants, on what china, with what flowers, at what temperature, with what card at each place, with what progression from course to course. His advice was precise enough to be followed and vague enough to require his continued guidance, which was a neat arrangement for someone whose value depended entirely on being consulted regularly. He championed French cuisine, French wines, and French customs with an intensity suggesting he found America slightly disappointing on a culinary level, and was doing his best to correct this as a matter of personal responsibility. He imported chefs from France when domestic alternatives were available, imported wine when American wine existed, and once reportedly spent several days doing nothing but planning the menu for a single dinner, approaching the task with focused deliberation that other men of his era applied to financial instruments or military strategy. The dinner was, by contemporary accounts, extraordinary. Guests ate superbly, went home satisfied, and discussed the evening for weeks. McAllister felt this proved his point entirely. The 400, a term he coined to describe the number of people who actually mattered in New York society, was partly social philosophy and partly practical observation. Caroline Astor's ballroom held approximately 400 people, and if someone was not on the list, they were by definition not among the people who mattered. This is either a reasonable description of how exclusive social circles function, or an extraordinary act of social arrogance dressed up as observation, and McAllister, who died in 1895 convinced he'd spent his life doing important work, would not have recognised the distinction as meaningful. One of the defining obsessions of Gilded Age dining was the belief that French cuisine was inherently superior to all other forms of cooking, that a dish was meaningfully improved by having a French name, and that the failure to serve French food at your dinner table communicated something unfortunate about your seriousness as a host, and possibly as a person. This belief was not entirely without basis. It was, however, applied with an enthusiasm that sometimes outpaced the skills available to support it. French culinary tradition in the 19th century was genuinely remarkable. It had developed over centuries into a system of extraordinary technical sophistication, built around classical preparations and the famous mother sauces from which countless variations descended. When skilled practitioners worked within this system, the results were exactly as good as their reputation suggested. Sauces of layered complexity, pastry of architectural precision, preparations that transformed raw ingredients into something that tasted, honestly, like a very good argument for paying close attention to cooking. The tradition deserved its reputation. The problem was not the tradition. The problem was what happened when the tradition met hosts who wanted the results without the requisite kitchen to produce them. Gilded Age hosts frequently applied the logic of French cuisine without being able to fully apply the technique. They demanded French menus. They insisted on French names for every course. They hired French chefs when they could afford to, and when they could not, they hired whoever was available and asked them to produce French results anyway, which worked better in some kitchens than others, and produced, in the less well-equipped establishments, food that was impeccably named and variably executed. The guests ate politely and said the food was wonderful, because saying otherwise was not an option in a social environment where the host's feelings outrank the accuracy of the review. The truly serious hosts hired actual French chefs, which resolved the quality problem and created a different set of problems involving temperament, communication, and the specific dynamics of employing someone who considered themselves an artist in a household that considered them a servant. French chefs of the era were known for exacting standards, strong opinions about ingredient quality, and a willingness to make those opinions audible in the middle of a service. Several Gilded Age memoirs treat the French chef as a recurring character in the domestic drama of the house. Talented, indispensable, occasionally volcanic, and absolutely certain about the correct way to make a bechamel, which happened to be their way, which was the only way, and if you had questions they were prepared to address them immediately and at length. When the kitchen was capable and the ingredients were correct and the timing held, the results were genuinely extraordinary. Sauces built over many hours from stocks that had themselves taken many hours, reductions of remarkable intensity, pastry constructions that held their shape through a long dinner service without apology. Gilded Age French cuisine at its finest was not pretending to be something it was not. It was exactly what it claimed to be. The difficulty was simply that the gap between ambition and execution, in kitchens that could not quite support the ambition, produced dinners that were French in name and aspiration, and something else entirely in practice. Nobody said a word. The host refilled your glass. The evening continued. The French remained blameless throughout. In the middle of a 12-course Gilded Age dinner, at the precise moment when guests had eaten enough to feel the first quiet intimations of regret, and not yet enough to feel the full settled weight of consequence, something arrived at the table that occupied a category entirely its own. It was neither entirely food nor entirely drink. It was cold, sharp, slightly alcoholic, and presented as a palate cleanser, which is a polite way of describing something whose actual function was to convince your digestive system that it was still interested in eating when, left to its own preferences, it was beginning to have serious reservations. This was Roman punch, and it was one of the great practical inventions of Gilded Age entertaining. The preparation varied by kitchen, but generally involved lemon ice, sugar, and some combination of rum and champagne, served in small glasses or, in more theatrical households, in carved ice cups or frosted silver vessels. It arrived cold enough to shock the palate out of whatever comfortable numbness the previous courses had produced, and it contained just enough alcohol to make the arrival of the next course feel like something to look forward to rather than something to endure. It was functionally a reset button served in a glass, and it worked with a reliability that speaks well of either the recipe or the psychology of Gilded Age dining, or quite possibly both simultaneously. The intermezzo, as this pause was sometimes called, was listed explicitly on printed menus and anticipated by regular diners the way a familiar rest stop is anticipated on a long journey. Not because it is a destination, but because it marks the midpoint, confirms that you have come this far, and provides a brief, welcome suspension of forward motion. Guests who had been performing the social labour of a formal dinner for 2 hours, maintaining conversation, managing their silverware, attending to the person on their left and the person on their right with approximately equal energy, were permitted by the arrival of Roman punch to exhale very slightly. The posture relaxed. The conversation loosened. A joke was told that might not have been appropriate at the soup course. Then the roast arrived and everyone straightened up immediately. The Roman punch also served a quieter social function that the people consuming it probably did not articulate, but would have recognized immediately. The pause created space for the kind of brief, unguarded exchange that the formality of the rest of the evening suppressed. 2 guests who had been maintaining careful public personas through the fish and the soup might find, in the 3 minutes of the Roman punch, something slightly more honest to say to each other, not confessional, not indiscreet, but slightly more real than what the rest of the evening permitted. The ice loosened things in both a literal and a metaphorical sense. Some households debated the composition of Roman punch with the same seriousness applied to the wine list. Rum or brandy, champagne or still wine, lemon or lime, 1 egg white, beaten or none. The Roman punch that arrived flat or warm, or insufficiently sour, or in the wrong vessel, was a small failure in a performance where small failures accumulated into larger impressions. The Roman punch that arrived precisely right, cold and bright and perfectly timed, was the moment that separated a very good dinner from an excellent one, which sounds like a distinction too small to matter until you understand that in Gilded Age society, distinctions that small were often the only ones that did. Let us now address the peacock, which is simultaneously a bird, an aesthetic problem, and during the Gilded Age, a dinner course that raised questions nobody was quite comfortable asking directly. The medieval tradition of serving large birds in their full plumage, with feathers carefully removed, the bird roasted, and the feathers reattached afterward for presentation was revived during this era by hosts who had decided that ordinary food presentation was insufficient, and that their roast should arrive at the table looking as though it had not fully committed to the concept of being dinner. Peacocks appeared at Gilded Age tables not because peacock meat is particularly distinguished in flavour, which it is not, being described by most who have eaten it as tough, dry, and gamey in ways that make you understand immediately why it stopped being a regular menu item, but because a roasted peacock carried on a platter with its tail feathers fanned to full display is an image that communicates, clearly and without ambiguity, that the host has made choices. Specific, expensive, labour-intensive, aesthetically committed choices. The peacock said, "I considered serving duck, and I rejected it as insufficient to the occasion. This evening deserved more than duck." Swan appeared similarly restored to a semblance of pre-roasting dignity. Pheasant arrived in full plumage, its feathers gleaming under candlelight. Game birds of various kinds came to the table in states of presentation that made them appear to exist in the ambiguous zone between the wild and the kitchen. more alive-looking than was strictly accurate, which was either impressive or unsettling depending on where you sat and how you felt about eyes. The eyes were often still present. This was considered correct and appropriate. The theatrical presentation of food was a recognised art form in the Gilded Age, with its own practitioners and standards of excellence. Pastry chefs constructed sugar sculptures of architectural ambition, ships, castles, mythological figures, baskets of flowers rendered in spun sugar with detail that makes you wonder what these people could have accomplished if redirected toward a different medium. Savoury cooks built aspic moulds of extraordinary geometric complexity. Cold buffets at large parties were arranged so that the dishes formed a unified visual composition rather than simply a collection of food. The whole table readable as a visual statement rather than an inventory of what was available for consumption. The problem inherent in all of this theatrical presentation was that eating it felt, at some level, like an act of cultural destruction. Guests at certain dinners reportedly hesitated before serving themselves from particularly elaborate preparations, uncertain whether dismantling a work of art was socially acceptable. The peacock in full tail display does not invite you to pick up a serving fork. The sugar castle does not suggest it wants to be broken. Hosts navigated this by having servants do the initial carving and portioning, removing the guest from the moment of destruction and preserving the illusion of the centerpiece for as long as possible. This worked reasonably well for the first 3 people served and became increasingly theoretical for everyone who came after, by which point the peacock looked considerably less majestic and considerably more like what it always was, dinner. The Gilded Age produced 2 dining cultures that occupied the same city blocks in close physical proximity, and rarely acknowledged each other's existence except in newspaper editorials and the occasional bout of public conscience. One was the culture of fashionable restaurants and private entertaining among the very wealthy. The other was the culture that fed everyone else, which is to say almost everyone, which is to say the actual majority of people living in American cities during this period, whose relationship with food was defined not by what could be made spectacular, but by what could be made to last until Friday. A fashionable dinner at Delmonico's for a party of 8 might cost several $100s, including wine, before the evening's additional expenses, before the flowers, before the private rooms surcharge, before the gratuities distributed to the army of staff who had made the experience seamless. The host who spent this amount considered it a reasonable investment in a specific kind of social visibility. The working man eating lunch at a nearby counter spent 10 cents and ate whatever the kitchen had prepared that day, which was almost certainly filling and almost certainly brown, and was not accompanied by a printed menu in French. These 2 realities were separated not just by money, but by the entire conceptual apparatus of Gilded Age class distinction, which held that the poor ate to survive and the wealthy ate to demonstrate that survival was not in question. This is not a sophisticated philosophy, but it was an operative one, and it shaped every menu, every dining room, every food publication of the era. Cookbooks directed at wealthy households assumed cost was not a consideration, and that the primary constraints were taste, fashion, and the availability of seasonal ingredients. Cookbooks directed at households of more modest means spent considerable space on economy, on making ingredients, stretch, on producing meals that were adequate without being wasteful, which is a very different culinary problem and produces very different food from very different kitchens with very different intentions. What is interesting is that the gap between these 2 cultures was not as fixed as it might appear from the outside. Certain dishes moved between them. Oysters travelled down from luxury to street food and back up again over the course of a few decades. Certain preparations fashionable in fine restaurants found their way into domestic cooking once techniques became accessible and ingredients became affordable, and certain ambitious restaurants in the middle range, not Delmonico's but not the Chop House either, attempted to offer something approximating elegance at prices that didn't require inherited money, catering to a growing middle class with some disposable income and considerable interest in spending it on food that felt like an occasion worth dressing for. The $7 dinner and the $60 dinner, separated by the width of a Manhattan block and the entirety of the American class system, were both expressions of the same basic human activity: eating with others and wanting the experience to mean something beyond mere nutrition. The wealthy version had more courses and better china. The ordinary version had more company and less silverware to worry about. Which one constituted the better dinner is a question the Gilded Age would not have recognised as meaningful, but which seems from this distance genuinely worth sitting with. Behind every great Gilded Age dinner was a kitchen, and behind many of the greatest kitchens of the era was Charles Ranhofer, the chef who ran Delmonico's for the better part of 3 decades, and who regarded American cuisine not as a limitation, but as an invitation to do something that had never quite been done before. He was French-born and classically trained, with all the technical rigour and personal conviction that implied, and he brought both to a country that was, in culinary terms, still in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. Ranhofer was not dismissive of American ingredients, which distinguished him from some European contemporaries who viewed the New World's larder with the polite condescension of people who have made up their minds in advance. He understood that the northeastern coast offered seafood of extraordinary quality. He understood that American game birds properly prepared were worthy of serious culinary attention. He understood that the continent's agricultural abundance, combined with New York's position as the entry point for the world's luxury goods, created a kitchen situation of unusual richness, and he was prepared to exploit it fully in the French sense of the word, which is to say with skill and without apology. His approach was French in technique and American in ingredient, and the result belonged to neither tradition entirely and to both simultaneously. A. Ranhofer dinner at Delmonico's felt thoroughly Parisian in its pacing, its structure, its seriousness about what food could accomplish when treated with sufficient attention. The specific flavours on the plate were unmistakably of this continent, of these waters and these fields. Guests who had eaten at the finest restaurants in Paris recognised the register without being able to locate the accent, which was, probably, exactly what Ranhofer intended and what distinguished his work from simple imitation. His cookbook, The Epicurean, published in 1894, is one of the remarkable documents of American culinary history, and also one of the more intimidating objects you can place on a kitchen counter. It runs to nearly 1,000 pages. It contains recipes for over 3,000 dishes. It includes instructions not just for cooking, but for the entire apparatus of formal dining, the table settings, the service timing, the training of kitchen staff, the management of the specific operational anxieties that arise when you're cooking for several hundred people simultaneously, and the terrapin has not yet arrived from its supplier, and the first guests are already in the front hall. This is a book written by someone who had encountered every possible problem in producing a great dinner, and had developed, through decades of experience, a considered response to each one. Working in Ranhofer's era meant working without mechanical refrigeration, without gas ranges of the modern type, without electric light in the kitchen, and without any organisational technology beyond the hierarchy of a French kitchen brigade, which was itself an extraordinarily sophisticated human system, a chain of command with the clarity of a military unit and the creative tension of an artistic collaboration. What he produced within these constraints, night after night, for 30 years, for the most demanding audience in American social life, represents a professional achievement that is difficult to fully appreciate without imagining the conditions surrounding it. Not all Gilded Age food excess was built from cream sauces and roasted animals, and champagne served in feed bags on horseback, though most of it was. The era also produced notable obsessions with specific vegetables, and the most fashionable vegetable of all was asparagus, which occupied a position in the dining culture of the 1880s and 90s, roughly comparable to the position avocado occupies in the early 21st century. Simultaneously expensive, desirable, associated with a specific kind of person, and capable of communicating something not entirely modest about the person who served it. White asparagus imported from France or Belgium was considered distinctly superior to the green American variety, and appeared on the finest tables with the confident regularity of an ingredient that had decided its provenance was part of its appeal. It cost more than the domestic alternative, not because the flavour difference was so pronounced as to justify the price, but because it was more difficult to obtain, more expensive to transport, and more clearly European, all of which were properties that Gilded Age dining valued independently of their relationship to actual taste. You were not just serving asparagus, you were serving asparagus that had crossed an ocean to be here, and you wanted that acknowledged. Giant asparagus arrived on tables bundled and tied with ribbon, presented as though the asparagus itself were a gift, which in the context of Gilded Age entertaining it essentially was. It appeared as a garnish of almost sculptural ambition, as a side dish accompanied by sauces of considerable complexity, and as the subject of cold preparations in which the spears were arranged with the geometric precision of a parquet floor. Asparagus in cream sauce was fashionable. Asparagus in aspic, suspended in clear gelatin in decorative moulds unmoulded at the table, was very fashionable. Cold asparagus with a vinaigrette composed in proportions that were clearly not improvised was the kind of thing that got noted in a letter home to someone who would understand why it mattered. The correct way to eat asparagus provoked genuine debate in the etiquette columns that were themselves a significant literary genre of the era, with the fingers, as the French ate it, respecting the vegetable's nature as something meant to be held and bitten, or with a fork, as the demands of decorum seemed to require, even if this meant negotiating the asparagus into smaller pieces in a way that compromised both the experience and the visual effect. This was not a trivial question in an environment where the table was a performance, and every gesture was visible to people who would be discussing the evening the following morning over their own considerably plainer breakfasts. Truffles commanded similar reverence throughout the era. Their expense was genuine, their flavour unmistakable, and their association with France complete enough that serving them required no further justification. They appeared shaved over eggs, folded into sauces, tucked into pastry preparations, and in at least one documented case served as a standalone course in quantities representing a significant financial outlay per person. This was considered appropriate. The truffle did not need defending. In the Gilded Age dining room, the truffle was its own argument, and nobody at the table was going to disagree with it. Dessert in the Gilded Age was not an afterthought. It was not a pleasant conclusion to an already complete meal. It was a third act, a finale, and in many cases a construction project of genuine ambition that arrived at the table looking less like something you were supposed to eat and more like something you were supposed to quietly applaud before anyone touched it. And at the centre of Gilded Age dessert culture, the ingredient that made the most spectacular effects possible was ice cream. Ice cream was made in moulds throughout this period, and the moulds were entirely the point. The technology of moulded frozen desserts had reached, by the 1880s, a level of sophistication allowing skilled pastry chefs to produce ice cream in the shape of a peach, so convincing that guests reportedly reached for it before realizing it was not actual fruit. Strawberries, melons, grapes, entire baskets of miniature fruit rendered in coloured and flavoured ice cream arrived at tables looking like something assembled by a very dedicated and very cold sculptor. An eagle with wings extended, A swan, its neck curved in the specific posture of a swan that has accomplished something. A cornucopia filled with smaller ice cream fruits. These were not tricks or novelties. They were the expected standard of presentation at any dinner of significance, and a pastry chef who could not produce them was a pastry chef whose continued employment was about to become a subject of quiet discussion. The logic of moulded ice cream was the same logic governing every other spectacular element of the Gilded Age table. The moment of arrival mattered as much as what followed. The peacock with its reattached feathers, the elaborate centerpiece fountain, the gold-dusted meringue. All of them created a pause, a moment of visual impact before eating began, a few seconds during which guests acknowledged that something had been accomplished. The moulded ice cream peach, carried to the table on a silver platter and briefly displayed before being served, produced exactly this pause. It was theatre, and in the Gilded Age, theatre and dinner were essentially the same event presented in different costumes. Bombe glacée added another layer of drama entirely. This preparation, a dome of one flavour of ice cream concealing different flavours inside, was designed specifically for the moment of cutting. When the server sliced through the exterior, the interior layers were revealed in cross-section, perhaps vanilla surrounding raspberry surrounding chocolate, or coffee surrounding praline. The cross-section was the point, the visual revelation, the proof that something more had been hidden inside the thing you were looking at, which is, if you think about it, a surprisingly good metaphor for the Gilded Age itself and how it operated at almost every level. Charlotte Russe, a cold dessert of Bavarian cream set inside a ring of ladyfingers and unmoulded at the table, performed a similar theatrical function before escaping the formal dining room entirely and appearing on street carts around the turn of the century, sold for a few cents in a cardboard cup. This descent from fashionable table to sidewalk snack represents one of food history's more cheerful moments of democratic redistribution. The same dessert that had graced Carolyn Astor's table was being eaten while waiting for a streetcar in Lower Manhattan. The Gilded Age, despite its best efforts, could not entirely contain what it created. One of the stranger dynamics of Gilded Age food culture, and one that becomes considerably less strange when you consider the dynamics of contemporary media, was the role of the press in sustaining, amplifying, and in some sense actively producing the culture of spectacular entertaining that defined the era. Newspapers covered fashionable dinners with an intensity usually reserved for political events, and sometimes with more obvious enjoyment, because political events required balance and nuance, while a dinner party where guests ate on horseback required only a vivid description and sufficient column inches. A particularly lavish party hosted by a well-known figure could generate coverage across multiple editions and multiple papers simultaneously, each approaching the same event from a slightly different angle. The society column described the flower arrangements in reverent detail, while the editorial page expressed indignation about what the cost of those flowers could have purchased in terms of tenement improvements. Both pieces ran. Both generated responses. Both sold papers. This was not a contradiction so much as a business model. The Gilded Age table was, among other things, content, and the newspapers of the era were extraordinarily effective at monetizing it from every available angle simultaneously. This created a feedback loop of some consequence. The wealthy hosted extraordinary dinners, partly because extraordinary dinners generated coverage. The coverage confirmed that the dinner had been extraordinary. Other wealthy people read the coverage and felt the specific social pressure of someone else's spectacle being publicly acknowledged while their own was not. They planned more elaborate dinners. Newspapers covered those too. Everyone ate more courses, spent more money on centerpieces, and escalated further, until the progressive era arrived and changed the moral weather sufficiently that the most extravagant displays became difficult to justify publicly, even when they continued to occur privately. The editorial response to Gilded Age entertaining was reliably split in a way that seems, in retrospect, almost designed to maximize total readership. Papers aimed at working-class readers expressed righteous indignation. The cost of a single dinner, exceeding a labourer's annual wages, laid out in terms that left no ambiguity about the moral evaluation being performed. Papers aimed at social aspirants described the same events in terms of beauty, sophistication, and the apparent effortlessness with which the very rich conducted themselves at table. Both publications were read by overlapping audiences. Some readers wrote in to express outrage. Others requested more detail about the menu. Some probably did both within the same week. The hosts themselves were not passive observers of this dynamic. Many understood it explicitly and worked it actively. Details of upcoming dinners were leaked to society, editors in advance, creating anticipation that built the cultural significance of the event before it occurred. Menus were made available to newspapers that requested them, which newspapers did because readers demanded them, because the menus were fascinating in the specific way that other people's extravagance is always fascinating, simultaneously uncomfortable and entirely impossible to put down. The Gilded Age dinner party was one of the earlier examples of what would much later be called personal branding. The hosts were not just eating, they were publishing themselves, one course at a time. A detail about Gilded Age entertaining that tends to get lost in the general astonishment over the 12-course dinner is what happened after the 12-course dinner, because in many cases what happened was another meal, not a full dinner technically, but a meal substantial enough to require a table, multiple dishes, and the kind of organisational effort most people reserve for events they had been planning for weeks rather than for a casual extension of an evening that had already included 12 courses and 4 hours of sustained wine service. The midnight supper was a fixture of fashionable social life, appearing most commonly after balls, after theatre performances, and after other evening events that concluded late enough that the guests had missed their normal dinner hour, and early enough that going home without further acknowledgement of the night felt abrupt. The logic was not entirely without merit. If you had spent 3 hours at the opera and it was now 11:30 and you were hungry, then a late supper was a reasonable response. The execution, however, was rarely confined to the reasonable, and was almost never confined to the simple. Midnight suppers featured cold dishes largely, because the kitchen had usually wound down from main service, and could not support another full hot production without advance notice. But cold in a Gilded Age kitchen that had been planning all day did not mean simple or unconsidered. Lobster salad of considerable complexity, arranged on platters prepared during the afternoon. Cold game in aspic, set in moulds and unmoulded onto silver platters, with a care suggesting the aspic had feelings about its presentation. Elaborate sandwiches bearing approximately the same relationship to an ordinary sandwich that the 12-course dinner bore to lunch. Jellied preparations, terrines, carefully composed cold plates that demonstrated, even at midnight, even after 4 hours of a ball, that nobody in this household was going to allow standards to slip simply because the servants had been awake since 6 in the morning. What the midnight supper created beyond the food itself was a different social register from the formal dinner. The seating was less rigid. The table was often buffet style, which meant guests moved around, encountered people they had not been placed next to at dinner, and had conversations the formality of the earlier evening had prevented. The champagne was still flowing, but in the easier mode of a late-night champagne rather than the performative mode of dinner party champagne. People were tired in ways that reduced their defences. Things got said at midnight suppers that would not have been said at dinner. Alliances formed. Confidences were exchanged. The social business of the Gilded Age was conducted as so much social business is, in the comfortable margins of the official event rather than at its formal centre. None of the extraordinary food of the Gilded Age would have been possible without one foundation that goes largely unnoticed in the more spectacular accounts of the era: ice. Before mechanical refrigeration, which became commercially viable only toward the very end of this period, the entire infrastructure of cold food in America ran on natural ice cut from frozen ponds and rivers during winter months, stored in insulated ice houses and distributed by an industry of considerable size and sophistication that has since been almost entirely forgotten because it was replaced by electricity and compressors and the absence of any immediate need to explain it to anyone born after 1920. The ice trade in 19th century America was enormous and surprisingly complex. Companies sent workers onto frozen New England lakes in January with specialized saws and tongs to cut blocks of ice to standard size, which were then stored in massive insulated warehouses under layers of sawdust that slowed the melt considerably. From these warehouses, ice was shipped by rail throughout the country, arriving in cities where it was distributed to homes, restaurants, hotels, and any establishment requiring cold temperatures for any purpose. The icebox, a simple cabinet with an insulated compartment for a block of ice and a drip pan below, was the refrigerator of the era, and managing it was a daily domestic responsibility involving checking the melt, rate, timing the delivery, and organising contents correctly to maintain the coldest temperatures for the most perishable items near the ice itself. For Gilded Age kitchens producing elaborate dinners for large parties, ice was not a convenience, but a structural necessity around which the entire production was organised. Butter sculpture required constant cold to maintain its shape through the hours preceding service. Ice desserts required ice not just for service, but throughout the making, the moulding, the setting, and the transport to the dining room. Aspics, those elaborate jellied preparations appearing throughout formal menus, set because gelatin requires low temperature to solidify, and held their shape through the preceding courses only because the kitchen had managed the cold chain from start to finish without a gap or a miscalculation. The visual architecture of formal Gilded Age dining, the moulded dishes, the cold terrines, the ice cream sculptures, the chilled champagne, was not just the product of skilled cooking. It was the product of a supply chain built entirely on frozen water and the human labour required to extract, transport, store and distribute it in sufficient quantities to support a culture of elaborate cold food across every fashionable household and restaurant in the country. Mechanical refrigeration arrived in the 1880s and 90s and began slowly transforming the commercial food industry. The ice trade contracted steadily as electric refrigeration became more reliable and widely available. The era of natural ice ended, and the entire elaborate infrastructure of ice houses, ice cutters, and ice delivery men transitioned quietly from daily reality to historical curiosity that most people today have never had reason to consider. No account of Gilded Age dining is complete without addressing the wine, and no account of Gilded Age wine is complete without beginning with champagne, which occupied a position in the social imagination of the era that no other beverage before or since has quite matched. Champagne in the Gilded Age was not simply a celebratory drink reserved for moments of particular significance. It was a signal, a symbol, a social atmosphere, and in certain households a kind of continuous environmental condition, present throughout the evening the way background music is present in a modern restaurant. Not always the centre of attention, but always contributing, and noticed immediately if it stopped. French champagne houses marketed to American buyers with intensity reflecting both the size of the market and the enthusiasm of the purchasers. Moet, Veuve Clicquot, Pommery, Perrier-Jouët. These names circulated in American society columns with a familiarity suggesting they were not foreign producers, but established presences in the social landscape, which by the 1880s they essentially were. The very best champagnes were poured throughout formal dinners as part of a coordinated wine service that also included still wines selected to accompany specific courses. A properly managed Gilded Age wine service might offer sherry with the soup, white Burgundy with the fish, red Bordeaux with the roast, Sauterne with the dessert, and champagne running throughout as a continuous thread unifying the various movements of the evening into a single sustained experience of abundance. The quantities consumed at fashionable dinners were substantial in ways the historical record describes with a matter-of-factness suggesting this was not considered remarkable at the time. Cases of wine passing through a dinner party of moderate size, individual guests consuming quantities that would, by current guidelines, represent several days' recommended allowance in a single sitting. The morning after a grand dinner at one of the Newport cottages was, by all available evidence, a quiet affair conducted largely in a horizontal position, with the curtains drawn and request for plain food and still water, which represents the specific condition of having had a genuinely magnificent time. Nobody appears to have considered this a problem requiring correction. It was understood as a natural consequence of doing things properly and seeing them through to their conclusion. Wine knowledge was a social asset in the Gilded Age, in the same way French cuisine was a social asset. It signalled cultivation, European influence, and the kind of leisure required to develop genuine familiarity with a subject demanding sustained attention and continuous expense. Fashionable hosts collected wine cellars with the acquisitive enthusiasm applied to art, with the complication that wine requires management in a way a painting does not, that improper storage can destroy what money has acquired, and that a cellar improperly maintained said something specific about the household responsible for it. The great cellar, properly managed, served at the correct temperature, offered in the right sequence at the right moment, was a demonstration of everything the Gilded Age valued: wealth, knowledge, discipline, and the willingness to invest heavily in the pleasures of a single evening shared with exactly the right people. A feature of Gilded Age formal dining that has not survived into modern entertaining with any particular enthusiasm, for reasons that will become entirely clear, is the after-dinner speech, which occupied a slot between the end of the dessert course and the departure of the guests and could, in the wrong hands, constitute a more significant endurance challenge than the 12 courses that had preceded it. The food, whatever its ambitions, eventually ended. The speech, without a strong moderating influence, could continue indefinitely and sometimes did. Formal dinners of any civic or political significance included toasts as a matter of course, and toasts included remarks, and remarks had a documented tendency to expand under favourable social conditions into speeches of considerable duration. A political dinner might include 4 or 5 speakers, each of whom had been invited partly because they were expected to speak, and partly because their speaking was expected to reflect well on the host and on the occasion. These expectations were not always met with equal success across all speakers in attendance. The speaker who was brilliant and brief was remembered with genuine gratitude. The speaker who lost the thread somewhere around the 12-minute mark and was still recovering at 25 was also remembered, but differently, in letters and diaries where honesty was permissible. The ability to give a good after-dinner speech was a recognised and genuinely valued social skill in the Gilded Age, distinct from other forms of public oratory in its specific requirements. The tone was expected to be warm and lightly humorous without being comedic, the length moderate without being abbreviated, the content flattering to the host, and the occasion without tipping into the excessive praise that becomes uncomfortable for everyone in the room. The delivery needed to be confident and natural, never laboured, never effortful, suggesting a man who had prepared thoroughly while appearing to have prepared not at all. This is a specific and demanding combination of qualities, and the men who possessed it were prized dinner companions whose presence was sought precisely for this reason, and not just for their appetite. Men who lacked these qualities were nonetheless occasionally called upon to speak, because social obligation does not always align with talent, and the results were the subject of detailed accounts in the diaries and letters of people who had been required to sit through them. The excessive length was the most common offence, followed by the tendency to mistake the occasion's solemnity for an invitation to lecture at length, followed closely by the complete failure of any joke that had seemed, in private, rehearsal entirely appropriate and amusing. The toast itself, the brief raised glass moment formally opening any speech, was a separate skill from the speech following it, and its correct execution. The exact right words, the right pause, the right lift of the glass, the right sip was something guests watched and evaluated, with the same close attention they brought to every other element of an evening that was, from beginning to end, a performance in which everyone participated whether they intended to or not. The Gilded Age produced cookbooks in substantial numbers, and those cookbooks are, in retrospect, among the most revealing documents the era left behind. More candid in some ways than the diaries and letters of the people who wrote and read them, because a cookbook must be specific where a letter can be vague, must commit to quantities and methods where a memoir can remain impressionistic, and must address its reader directly in a way that reveals exactly what the author believes that reader needs, wants, knows, and fears about the act of feeding other people. At one extreme was Ranhofer's Epicurean, the cathedral of professional cooking, addressed to chefs and serious household cooks, and filled with preparations of such technical difficulty that attempting them at home without professional training would require either a very patient family or a willingness to accept an intermediate number of significant failures before achieving anything resembling the intended result. The Epicurean was not a book for people who cooked 3 nights a week between other responsibilities. It was a book for people whose entire professional lives were organised around the production of food at an extreme level of sophistication, and it addressed them as such, with the assumption that they already knew things most people would spend years learning before attempting. At the other extreme were the household economy manuals directed at women managing modest domestic budgets, which treated food not as a vehicle for social aspiration but as a daily practical problem requiring intelligent and economical solutions. These books covered the same basic building blocks of American cooking: roasting, braising, baking, preserving, but from a position of scarcity rather than abundance. They advised on stretching ingredients, on using every part of an animal, on timing meals to both the seasons and the budget cycles of a household that didn't have money left over after necessities were addressed. They were written by people who understood necessity from the inside, and they are, in their own way, as technically sophisticated as the Epicurean, just oriented toward a completely different set of problems with completely different constraints. In the middle of these two extremes were the aspirational cookbooks, and these the most interesting for what they reveal about the social anxieties of the era. Addressed to households with some money but not vast. Money, people who wanted to entertain well, to set a table reflecting positively on themselves, to serve food recognised as correct by guests who might know what correct looked like. These books devoted enormous space to social conduct alongside cooking instruction. The proper sequence of courses, the correct implements for each, the appropriate way to manage the serving of wine, the clearing of plates, the receiving and seating of guests. These were not incidental concerns. They were, in many pages, the primary concern, with the recipes serving as supporting material for the more urgent project of appearing to be the kind of person who knew what they were doing at a dinner table. The food was almost secondary to the performance it enabled, which is in retrospect a perfect description of the Gilded Age itself. All of this, the 12 courses, the terrapin soup, the gold-dusted meringues, the dinners conducted on horseback in sod-covered Manhattan restaurants, could not continue indefinitely, and it did not. Nothing built primarily on spectacle and excess survives the arrival of genuine scarcity or genuine moral seriousness, and the Gilded Age table eventually encountered both, arriving together in the form of the Progressive Era, which brought a changed climate of opinion about what wealth should be doing, and, perhaps more importantly, how publicly it should be doing it. Reform movements of the early 20th century attacked the political and economic structures of the Gilded Age with directness and documented effectiveness that eventually produced genuine changes in law, in regulation, and in the distribution of economic power. But they also attacked the cultural structures, and the culture of spectacular entertaining was not immune from this. The same editorial writers who had once covered society dinners with a mixture of awe and theatrical indignation began, around the turn of the century, to cover them with something colder and more sustained. Of all straightforward comparison between what was being spent and what that money could alternatively accomplish, made without the implicit acknowledgement that this was simply how the rich behaved and always would. Something had shifted in what was considered acceptable to say publicly, and the Gilded Age table found itself in a moral environment it had not been designed to navigate. Scientific nutrition was also emerging during this period, with views about the 12-course dinner that could be summarized as, "This is not a good idea from a health perspective," expressed with a specific conviction of people who have recently discovered a principle and have not yet developed the nuance that comes from applying it to complex human situations. The idea that food should be selected primarily for its nutritional properties rather than its social signaling value was genuinely radical in the context of a dining culture that had spent several decades treating nutritional properties as essentially irrelevant. The elaborate cream sauces, the multiple roasted meats, the sequential dessert courses arriving after a full dinner had already been consumed, all of it became newly difficult to defend in the language that nutritional science made suddenly available and popular. The final practical blow was the First World War, which brought food conservation campaigns, meatless days, wheatless days, and a social climate where conspicuous consumption of any kind became very difficult to perform without appearing to lack awareness of what was happening elsewhere in the world. The elaborate, entertaining culture of the Gilded Age did not vanish at once. It contracted, simplified, and retreated into smaller and less visible forms, and never quite recovered its previous dimensions or its previous unapologetic confidence. The 12-course dinner became a relic. The terrapin was already gone. The gold leaf on the desserts was quietly removed, and the era that had made all of it seem not just acceptable but aspirational passed into history, leaving its cream sauces behind as evidence. While the front of the house was serving terrapin soup and gold-dusted meringues and ice cream moulded to look convincingly like fruit it was not, something else entirely was happening in the kitchens and servant quarters of Gilded Age mansions, and it deserves attention not because it contradicts the main story, but because it completes it, and because the story of who made the spectacle possible is at least as interesting as the story of who consumed it, while seated at a perfectly appointed table in white gloves. Domestic servants in wealthy households of this era ate better than their counterparts in most other working situations, in the specific sense that they had reliable access to food in quantity and variety, exceeding what they could have afforded independently. The kitchen of a great house produced food continuously, and the staff ate, but what they ate was fundamentally different from what they produced and served, different in kind and in intention, designed to fuel the work rather than to impress or delight the person consuming it. The elaborate preparations that went to the dining room upstairs did not find their way back to the kitchen table. Staff meals were simpler, plainer, organised around the same principles of economy and adequacy that governed cooking in any household of limited means, which the servants' quarters, despite their physical presence inside a house of extraordinary wealth, effectively remained. The kitchen itself occupied a world apart from the dining room it supplied, separated not just by the physical distance of stairs and corridors, but by a social distance of considerable magnitude. The head chef, if the household was grand enough to employ one, and the grandest certainly were, commanded a brigade that operated according to strict hierarchical principles, mirroring at a smaller scale the class structure being enacted in the rooms above. The hierarchy of the kitchen, the chef, the sous chef, the sauce cook, the pastry chef, the various junior cooks and assistants, had its own codes of conduct, its own expectations of deference, its own forms of recognition, and its own forms of humiliation. It was a world within a world, producing work judged by people who would never visit it, under conditions those people never considered. What the kitchen produced on the great nights of the Gilded Age, the 4-hour dinners, the midnight suppers, the elaborate banquets with their moulded ice cream and their reattached peacock feathers, represented sustained physical and organisational effort of considerable intensity, conducted under conditions of heat, pressure, and time constraint that modern restaurant kitchens would recognise, and Gilded Age dining rooms would never have imagined. The guests experienced the results as effortless. The kitchens that produced those results were the opposite of effortless. They were the engine of the whole enterprise, and like most engines, they were most visible when they failed, and nearly invisible when they worked, which in the best kitchens of the Gilded Age was most of the time, most nights, for the people who needed it to be. As we near the end of our tour through the Gilded Age table, we must pause for the finger bowl, which is simultaneously a small practical object, a significant social test, and one of the more enduring symbols of an era that turned every element of the dining experience, including the moment between eating dessert and eating fruit, into an opportunity for the display of correct knowledge and the possibility of visibly incorrect behaviour in front of exactly the wrong people. The finger bowl was a small bowl of water, typically lukewarm, often scented with a slice of lemon or a few rose petals, placed before each guest after the dessert course so that they might rinse their fingers before the final service of fruit and nuts. It served a genuine, hygienic purpose at a table where certain foods were eaten by hand and where the transition from dessert to fruit involved a shift in implements. It was also, in the context of Gilded Age formal dining, a social instrument of the first order, because using it correctly or incorrectly was one of the moments in a long evening that revealed clearly and without the possibility of later revision whether you had grown up knowing how things were done or whether you had arrived at the table from somewhere else entirely. The legend associated with the finger bowl involves a guest, placed at various times and tables depending on who is telling the story, who drinks from it under the reasonable if mistaken assumption that it is a beverage. The host, observing this, immediately drinks from their own finger bowl in solidarity, removing the social sting from the error by making the error universal. All other guests follow suit. Nobody acknowledges what has happened. The dinner continues. The story is told, as an example of perfect grace under social pressure, of the highest form of manners, which consists not in knowing all the rules, but in ensuring that nobody suffers for not knowing them. Whether this story is literally true in any specific instance is difficult to determine at this distance. What is clear is that it has survived for over a century and is still told because it captures something real about the experience of navigating extreme social formality. The ever-present possibility of error, the specific anxiety of not knowing what the small bowl of water is for, and the relief of encountering someone who responds to confusion with kindness rather than judgment. The Gilded Age table was designed to create exactly this kind of anxiety in people who were not born to it, and the finger bowl was one of its more elegant and understated instruments. It was small, it was innocent-looking, it was placed before you without explanation, requiring knowledge that could not be acquired in the moment, but only brought to the table from previous experience. It was the final question on an examination that had begun with the oyster fork and had not relented since. And the correct answer, it turned out, was not necessarily to know the answer, but to respond to the wrong answer with enough grace that the question stopped mattering, which is, in its way, the best lesson the entire Gilded Age table ever quietly taught anyone sitting at it. The Gilded Age is over, and has been for more than a century. The terrapin is no longer fashionable, and in most places no longer available, and its absence from the menu is one of the cleaner victories of the conservation movement over the appetites of the wealthy. The 12-course dinner has retreated to a small number of very expensive restaurants, where it is understood to be a deliberate experience rather than the expected format for a Tuesday evening. Ward McAllister is gone. Delmonico's is closed. Nobody is hosting dinner on a horseback, at least not in any establishment that has applied for the relevant permits and intends to stay open, and yet the Gilded Age left its fingerprints everywhere on the way Americans eat, think about eating, talk about eating, and judge each other for what they eat, in ways so thoroughly absorbed into the culture that they have ceased to look like history and simply look like how things are. The idea that a restaurant meal can be a theatrical experience, that the presentation of food matters as much as the flavour, that the sequence of courses is itself part of the pleasure, that the room and the service and the lighting and the wine list are components of a unified experience rather than incidental surroundings for the act of eating. All of this descends in a direct line from the culture of formal dining that the Gilded Age inherited, refined, and amplified to its logical extreme before the progressive era arrived and dialed it back somewhat. The tasting menu of a contemporary, fine dining restaurant with its parade of small composed courses and its carefully controlled pacing, its printed menu card and its wine pairing and its occasional theatrical element, the dish assembled at the table, the smoke introduced under a glass dome, the edible flower placed with tweezers by someone who takes this seriously, is a direct descendant of service à la Russe, updated for an era that has traded the 12-course French dinner for the 20-course chef's vision. The logic is identical. The food arrives in sequence. Each course creates a specific experience. The evening has a structure and a pace and a kind of narrative arc. The guest surrenders to it and trusts that the person who designed it knew what they were doing. The obsession with sourcing, with the provenance and story of ingredients, with knowing not just what you're eating but where it came from, who produced it, under what conditions, at what point in its optimal season. This too has roots in the Gilded Age, when knowing that your terrapin came from the Chesapeake and was prepared by a chef trained in Paris was a form of cultural literacy distinguishing the knowledgeable diner from the merely hungry one. The vocabulary has changed entirely, the underlying impulse that food carries meaning beyond nutrition, and that sophisticated diners demonstrate their sophistication through what they know about what they eat, has not changed at all, and shows no signs of doing so. What the Gilded Age could not have anticipated is that its excesses would become, for later generations, sources of genuine fascination rather than simply cautionary tales. The dinners designed to impress and exclude have become, 150 years later, compelling historical material for anyone who has ever wondered what happens when money removes all constraints on appetite and social performance simultaneously. The answer involves turtles, gold, horses, and an amount of cream that staggers the imagination, and it is, despite everything, a little bit magnificent. Let's take a moment to appreciate the mental gymnastics required to spend $45 per person on a dinner where your guests were sitting on horses, look yourself in the mirror the following morning, and conclude that you had behaved entirely reasonably. Because Gilded Age hosts did not simply spend extraordinary amounts of money on food and entertainment, they had a complete philosophical framework for why this spending was not only acceptable, but actively beneficial, and they were prepared to explain it at length to anyone who raised an eyebrow, which was a considerable number of people. The most popular justification was what historians sometimes call the trickle-down logic of conspicuous consumption, though the Gilded Age version of this argument was considerably more self-congratulatory than any modern equivalent. The reasoning went something like this. A grand dinner employs florists, caterers, wine merchants, kitchen, staff, waiters, stable hands, laundresses, silversmiths, china manufacturers, ice delivery men, and a small army of other trades and tradespeople whose livelihoods depend on the willingness of the wealthy to spend extravagantly on occasions that most people would consider unnecessary. By hosting a dinner of spectacular ambition, the wealthy host was not indulging a personal vanity, but rather performing a civic service, distributing money through the economy in ways that sustained employment and kept the commercial ecosystem of the city functioning at a level of productive activity it would not otherwise achieve. This argument had the considerable advantage of making extravagance sound like charity, which is exactly the kind of argument that extravagant people find extremely persuasive. There was also a more nakedly competitive logic that operated alongside the philosophical one, which was simply that in the Gilded Age social world your position was measured continuously and publicly by what you spent, what you served, who attended, and how elaborately you had thought through every element of the occasion. Standing still was not an option. If your neighbour hosted a dinner for 8 with terrapin soup and French champagne, and you responded with a dinner for 8 with terrapin soup and French champagne, you had not matched them. You had confirmed that you were operating at the same level. To advance, you had to exceed. This created a social arms race of catering that drove the cost of fashionable entertaining steadily upward through the last decades of the 19th century, with each escalation requiring the next to be still more ambitious, still more elaborate, still more difficult to describe without sounding like you were exaggerating. The press facilitated this beautifully. Every dinner that was covered in a society column became a benchmark against which future dinners would be implicitly measured. Every detail that was reported and admired became a standard that serious hosts felt obligated to meet and then surpass. The flowers that had been praised at the Vanderbilt dinner became the minimum acceptable floral arrangement at the next season's comparable event. The Novelty centerpiece that had generated the most column inches last year was the inspiration for something more ambitious this year. The whole enterprise moved forward on the fuel of publicity and competition simultaneously, with each reinforcing the other in a cycle that produced, at its peak, the specific absurdity of a Manhattan restaurant temporarily converted into an indoor pasture for the purpose of serving a formal dinner on horseback. What is fascinating is that almost nobody involved in this world expressed genuine discomfort with it, at least not publicly, at least not until the progressive era made public discomfort fashionable. Within the social world of the Gilded Age, the only acknowledged failure was the failure to be impressive enough, the dinner that was not quite good enough, the centerpiece that did not generate sufficient admiration, the wine that was not quite right for the course. The moral question of whether any of this should exist at all was simply not part of the conversation at the table, because the table was occupied by exactly the people for whom the answer was obvious. Of course it should exist. Of course this is what money is for. Of course this is civilization. And if you had questions about that, you had probably not been invited in the first place, which answered your questions fairly efficiently. The hosts who spent most extravagantly were also, in many cases, the same people who donated to hospitals, funded universities, and endowed libraries with their names carved above the entrance. This was not hypocrisy in their view, it was balance. You spent on beauty and spectacle because beauty and spectacle were worth spending on. You also gave to institutions because institutions were worth giving to. The two activities occupied different registers of the same fundamental conviction, that having enormous amounts of money created obligations, and that meeting those obligations in the most visible way possible was itself a kind of virtue. The dinner on horseback and the library with your name on it were, from this perspective, expressions of the same underlying philosophy, which was that wealth well displayed was wealth well used, and that the appropriate response to having more than you could reasonably spend was to spend it as impressively as possible, and call it a contribution to the cultural life of the nation. History has been somewhat sceptical of this framework, but the dinners were extraordinary, and the libraries are still open, and the people who ate terrapin soup on horseback in 1890-something are long gone, and what they left behind includes both the absurdity and the philanthropy in roughly equal measure, which is perhaps the most honest summary of the Gilded Age that anyone has managed to produce. It would be reasonable to assume that somewhere in the elaborate architecture of Gilded Age entertaining, the children were quietly removed to a separate room where they ate something simple and age-appropriate, and were expected to stay out of the way while the adults conducted the serious business of the 12-course dinner. This assumption would be partially correct and largely wrong, because the Gilded Age had complicated feelings about children's food that managed to be both extremely strict and extremely indulgent simultaneously, sometimes in the same household on the same evening, sometimes prepared by the same kitchen within the same hour. The children of wealthy Gilded Age families ate at their daily meals, food governed by the emerging science of childhood nutrition, which in the 1880s and 90s was producing recommendations of considerable austerity. Plain boiled foods were recommended, roasted meats without sauce, simple puddings, vegetables prepared without cream or butter, bread but not the interesting kinds. The logic was that children's digestive systems were delicate, and that the elaborate preparations appropriate for adult tables were too rich and too complex for young constitutions still developing the necessary internal equipment to process a 12-course dinner without incident. This was medically reasonable advice, and it was followed in some households with genuine rigour, and ignored in others with equal commitment, depending largely on whether the mother of the household was persuaded by the science or persuaded by the child, and children of the Gilded Age, it must be said, were often very persuasive. Because in the other direction, the Gilded Age also produced confections and sweets for children of extraordinary elaboration, the kind of thing that would make a modern paediatric dentist sit down quietly and take several deep breaths before speaking. Sugarwork of tremendous complexity was produced specifically for children's parties. Moulded ice creams in the shapes of animals, carriages, toys and fairy tale figures appeared at birthday celebrations and holiday gatherings. Elaborately decorated cakes rose to heights and architectural ambitions that suggested the baker had been given not a brief, but a challenge, and had responded to that challenge with everything they had available, and a personal conviction that restraint was for other people's children. The cakes themselves deserve a moment of attention, because they were not simply large cakes with frosting. They were constructions, layers of sponge and cream separated by architectural intentions, sugar flowers of botanical specificity arranged on surfaces decorated with scenes from nursery rhymes, or fairy tales executed in coloured icing by people who had trained for years to do exactly this kind of work. Some birthday cakes for the children of the very wealthy were apparently commissioned from the same confectioners, who produced the elaborate sugar sculptures for adult formal dinners, which means that the person who built a spun sugar castle for a Vanderbilt dinner party might the following week be building a spun sugar coach and horses for a 6-year-old's birthday, and approaching both commissions with equivalent seriousness and equivalent skill. Children's birthday parties in wealthy Gilded Age households were events of some social significance, attended not just by children but by their parents, who used the occasion to confirm social relationships and manage the ongoing business of who was in and who was slightly out in the children's social world, which mirrored the adult social world in its structure, if not quite in its consequences. The food at these parties was a scaled-down version of the spectacular food at adult entertainments, with the same emphasis on visual impact, the same investment in presentation, the same understanding that the moment of arrival of the centerpiece mattered as much as what followed. A birthday party whose centerpiece produced a gasp of genuine delight from the assembled children was a birthday party that would be mentioned the following week. A birthday party whose centerpiece was merely nice was a birthday party that would not be. What the children themselves ate at formal dinners, when they were permitted to attend formal dinners, varied considerably by household and by the age and perceived maturity of the child in question. Older children in fashionable families were sometimes introduced to formal dining as an educational exercise, seated at the table with adults and expected to manage the silverware, the courses, and the social demands of the occasion with as much composure as they could assemble on short notice and limited experience. This was understood as training, as the beginning of the long process by which a child of the upper class learned to perform the rituals that would define their adult social life. The food was not the point. The behaviour was the point. The food was simply the context in which behaviour was demonstrated and evaluated by every adult at the table who was paying attention, which was all of them. The specific challenge of introducing a child to formal dining in the Gilded Age was that the rituals being learned were genuinely complex, these silverware genuinely numerous, and the social stakes of getting it wrong, even as a child, genuinely real in the sense that the child's performance at the table reflected on the parents who had produced and trained the child, and the parents were very much aware of this. A child who used the wrong fork at a formal dinner was not simply making an understandable mistake. They were providing evidence about the quality of their upbringing, the attentiveness of their parents, and the general standards of the household from which they had emerged. The child would be corrected afterward, privately, firmly, and with the specific parental energy of someone who had been embarrassed in front of people whose opinion mattered. Younger children ate separately, with nurses or governesses, from menus that bore no resemblance to what was being served in the dining room 3 floors below. But the kitchen that produced the plain boiled chicken and the simple rice pudding for the nursery was the same kitchen producing the terrapin and the gold-dusted meringues for the dinner party, which says something about the range of culinary activity required of a great Gilded Age household on any given evening, and the remarkable organisational capacity of the kitchen staff who managed it. The cook who could produce the nursery menu and the formal dinner menu simultaneously, without allowing either to suffer from the divided tension the situation demanded, was a genuinely skilled professional operating at a level of multitasking that the era did not have a word for but understood and valued and paid accordingly, though never quite as much as the work required. The confectionery produced for children also had a social dimension extending beyond the birthday party into the daily commerce of fashionable social life. Gifts of elaborate sweets were exchanged between households as tokens of goodwill, carried by servants from one fashionable address to another in boxes tied with ribbon, with the quality and elaborateness of the contents communicating the same things that the flowers and the wine communicated at adult dinners. A box of handmade chocolates from the right confectioner, presented to the right child at the right moment, was a social gesture with a specific meaning that both the giver and the recipient's mother understood precisely and without the need for any explanation at all. Even the children's sweets were doing social work, in a world where almost everything edible was doing social work of one kind or another, and where the line between feeding people and performing your position in the social order was so thoroughly blurred that most people had stopped being able to see it as a line at all. It was simply how things were done. It was simply what dinner meant. And the children, seated at their separate tables with their plain boiled chicken and their elaborate birthday cakes, were learning both lessons simultaneously, which was, after all, exactly what the Gilded Age intended. If you have ever sat down at a formal table and counted the silverware with the quiet desperation of someone who suspects they are about to fail a test they did not know they were taking, then you have experienced, in a mild and survivable form, exactly what Gilded Age hosts intended you to experience. The elaborate table setting of the late 19th century was not merely decorative. It was a system of social stratification made physical, a landscape of objects designed to be entirely comfortable for people who had grown up surrounded by them, and entirely disorienting for people who had not, with absolutely no middle ground available, and no way to fake your way through it convincingly. A properly set Gilded Age table at a formal dinner of 12 or more courses began with a placement of silverware that extended several inches to each side of the plate and was organised according to a rule that was simple in principle and complex in execution. You worked from the outside in, using the implement farthest from the plate for the first course and progressing inward with each subsequent course. This rule, once you knew it, made complete sense. Before you knew it, the row of forks to your left and the row of knives and spoons to your right looked like an examination administered by someone who was not entirely on your side. The oyster fork was typically placed to the right of the soup spoon, pointing outward at a slight angle, and was used only once for the oyster course, after which it was removed with the oyster plates and replaced by nothing, because the fork that had been beside it was now the correct implement for the fish course. The fish knife had a distinctive shape, broader and flatter than an ordinary knife, with a blade designed specifically for separating fish flesh from bone, rather than cutting in the conventional sense. Using a regular knife on the fish was technically incorrect, and would be noticed by exactly the people you most wanted not to notice it. The fish fork was smaller than the dinner fork. The salad fork in households that serve salad as a separate course was smaller still. The dessert implements were sometimes already in position at the top of the place setting, above the plate, and sometimes brought in with the dessert course itself, depending on the household's particular preferences and the formality of the occasion. The china told its own story. Great Gilded Age households maintained multiple complete sets of china, each designed for specific occasions and specific courses. Soup bowls were not dinner plates. Fish plates were not soup bowls. The dessert service was entirely separate from the dinner service, and was usually the most decorative, the most fragile, and the most expensive, brought out only for occasions of sufficient significance to justify the risk of breakage. Some families had china services that had been commissioned specifically for them, decorated with their family crest, their monogram, or a design executed exclusively for their household by a European manufacturer who produced the pattern for nobody else. To eat from this china was to eat from an object that announced with every glance exactly whose table you were sitting at and what that meant. Crystal performed the same function at the level of the glass. Multiple glasses were present at each place setting simultaneously, one for each wine to be served during the course of the evening, arranged in a specific configuration that told the experienced diner exactly what was coming, and left the inexperienced diner wondering which glass was currently active and whether picking up the wrong one was the kind of thing that would end up in someone's diary entry the following morning. It was occasionally exactly that kind of thing. The point of all of this, the silverware and the china and the crystal and the finger bowls and the asparagus tongs and the specialised fish knives, was not simply to eat more elegantly. It was to create an environment in which the people who belonged felt immediately at home, and the people who did not belong felt immediately out of their depth, in a way that was entirely deniable because nobody said a word about it, and everyone behaved with perfect surface courtesy, while the sorting happened anyway, silently and efficiently, entirely through the arrangement of objects on a white linen tablecloth. It was one of the more elegant mechanisms of exclusion ever devised, and it worked beautifully for decades before the world changed enough to make it seem like what it had always been. The word cottage in ordinary usage suggests something modest, something manageable, something with a porch and a garden and perhaps a cat on the steps and the smell of something baking. The word cottage in Gilded Age Newport, Rhode Island, meant something else entirely, something that a person of ordinary expectations would look at and describe, at minimum as a palace, at maximum as a statement of intent so bold that it bordered on a declaration of something that polite society preferred not to name directly. Newport in the summer was where the seriously wealthy went to demonstrate that they were seriously wealthy in a setting that allowed for larger architectural gestures than Manhattan permitted. The Vanderbilts alone built multiple cottages in Newport, each of which contained more rooms than most people would visit in the course of a normal life, each of which required a staff of dozens to operate, and each of which was referred to, without apparent irony, as the cottage, a word that had apparently been stretched far, enough to cover almost anything if the person using it had sufficient social confidence. The food at these cottages was an extension of the same competitive entertaining culture that operated in Manhattan, but with the particular intensity of a summer resort, where everyone who mattered was present simultaneously, and the social comparison was therefore continuous rather than occasional. What you served at your Newport cottage dinner was observed and discussed with the same attention applied to what you served at your Fifth Avenue dinner party, but with the additional dynamic that your guests had likely just come from someone else's cottage the day before and would be going to someone else's the day after, which meant the comparison was not hypothetical, but immediate and specific. The kitchens of Newport cottages were serious professional operations. Cooks were brought from New York or occasionally from Europe. Provisions were ordered from the best suppliers in Boston and New York and shipped to Rhode Island with the same logistical planning applied to military supply chains. The wine cellars of the great cottages contained inventories that would have impressed a serious Paris restaurant, assembled over years with the advice of merchants and the application of considerable expense. The dining rooms of Newport cottages were designed to accommodate not just the family, but the social program that justified the cottage's existence in the first place. Tables that extended to seat 40. Sideboards of such scale that they required their own architectural consideration. Ceilings painted by artists brought from Europe specifically for this purpose, depicting classical scenes that suggested the owner had a relationship with antiquity that their actual biography did not entirely support, but that a sufficiently large dining room ceiling could make plausible. You sat beneath a painted sky of gods and heroes and ate your terrapin soup and felt, if the effect was working properly, that this was simply what dinner was. The servants who made this all possible lived in quarters that bore no resemblance to the rooms above, operated on schedules of such intensity during the summer season that the concept of rest was largely theoretical, and maintained the performance of effortless hospitality through the specific professional discipline of people who understood that their job was to be invisible in the precise degree that made everything appear to happen on its own. The greatest compliment you could pay to the management of a Newport cottage was to say that you never noticed the service, which meant the service had been perfect, which meant the people providing it had done everything correctly, and had done it while appearing not to exist. The cottages themselves have largely survived, most of them now museums, open to the public, their dining rooms restored to something approximating their original appearance, and their kitchens preserved as evidence of what was required to feed the kind of dinner their owners considered ordinary. Walking through them today, you can stand in the room where 40 people ate 12 courses in 1890-something, and look at the table and the china and the painted ceiling and understand in a way that photographs and descriptions do not quite convey exactly what scale of ambition was at work and what it required to sustain it. Every era eventually eats its last great dinner, though it rarely knows at the time that this is what is happening. The people at the table do not announce that the age is ending. The champagne does not taste different on the final evening from the way it tasted on all the evenings before it. The terrapin soup is still served correctly, the fish knife is still in its proper position, the Roman punch still arrives at precisely the right moment between the fourth and fifth courses. And then, gradually, over years rather than days, the era changes and the dinners change with it, and the world that made them possible and necessary and meaningful passes into history, leaving behind recipes and china patterns and the specific kind of nostalgia that attaches itself to things that were excessive and beautiful and gone. The Gilded Age ended not with a dramatic finale, but with a long, slow recession. The Progressive Era applied moral pressure. The First World War applied practical pressure. The income tax, introduced in 1913, began the long process of redistributing wealth in ways that made the financial foundations of spectacular entertaining somewhat less stable than they had been. The social world that had sustained the 12-course dinner, the dog dinner, the horseback dinner, the gold-dusted meringue, began to change in its values and its membership and its tolerance for the most extravagant demonstrations of who had the most. The daughters of Gilded Age fortunes married European aristocrats and imported their titles to America, and their daughters in turn grew up in a different century with different expectations about what a dinner was for and how long it should take. What the Gilded Age left behind, beyond the recipes and the surviving china, and the Newport cottages now open for tours on Tuesday through Sunday, was a set of questions about the relationship between food and power, between the table and the social order, between the act of eating and the act of performing your position, that have not been answered in the century since, and show no particular sign of being resolved in the century ahead. Every era has its version of the Gilded Age table. The context changes, the price points shift, the specific ingredients that signal status come and go, but the underlying dynamic using food to say something about yourself to the people watching remains as active and as socially consequential as it was when Ward McAllister was counting the number of people who mattered, and Charles Ranhofer was deciding what they would eat. The terrapin is gone and nobody is likely to bring it back, which is probably the correct outcome for the terrapin. The 12-course dinner exists now primarily as an experience offered by restaurants that charge accordingly and attract guests who understand they are participating in a kind of historical recreation, which is a different relationship with the format than the Gilded Age had, but is not an entirely discontinuous one. The obsession with provenance, with theatrical presentation, with the sequence and structure of a meal as a form of art rather than simply a form of nutrition, all of this persists and flourishes in the contemporary dining world in forms that the Gilded Age would recognise even if it would not recognise the specific dishes or the specific prices or the specific social anxieties driving the choices. What the era taught us about hunger, finally, is that hunger is never only about food. The appetite that drove a man to spend $600 on a dinner for his dog was not an appetite for food. It was an appetite for significance, for visibility, for the specific reassurance that comes from being seen to spend in ways that other people cannot. The hunger that built the Newport cottages and filled their dining rooms with 40 guests and terrapin soup and painted ceilings was a hunger for permanence, for the sense that the position you occupied was solid and acknowledged and beyond question. The hunger that made Ward McAllister count the 400 was a hunger for order, for a world with clear hierarchies and clear signals and clear answers to the question of who belonged and who did not. None of these hungers were satisfied by the food. They never are. The champagne runs out. The dinner ends. The guests go home. The kitchen staff cleans up. And in the morning, the same appetite that organised the evening is already planning the next one, because the reassurance that food and spectacle provide is real but temporary, and the temporary nature of it is precisely what keeps the table set and the kitchen running, and the whole extraordinary enterprise moving forward into the next season, the next dinner, the next attempt to say something with a meal that meals, however magnificent, can never quite fully say. And so here we are, at the end of the table. The last course has been cleared, the finger bowls have been removed, the champagne glasses are empty, the terrapin is gone, the peacock has been carried back to wherever peacocks go after a dinner party, and the horse, mercifully, has been returned to an actual stable where it belongs. Tonight you travelled through a world of extraordinary appetite, where the wealthy ate not simply because they were hungry, but because every bite was a declaration, every course was a performance, and every dinner was a small, elaborate argument about who mattered and why. You watched a nation with more money than it knew what to do with decide that the answer to that problem was cream sauce, and more of it, served in 12 consecutive acts with a Roman punch intermission and a moulded ice cream finale that looked nothing like food and tasted apparently like a very good idea. You heard about turtles pulled from the Chesapeake and turned into the most fashionable soup in the country, and then pulled from existence because fashion does not pause to count what it costs. You sat at tables where the centerpiece moved and the floor was covered in sod, and your champagne arrived in a feed bag because someone with $45 per person and a new stable had decided this was civilization. You watched dogs eat from China while workers a few blocks away ate whatever they could afford, which was not China, and was not terrapins, and was not anything that came with a printed menu in French. And somehow, through all of it, the food was genuinely extraordinary. Not the excess, not the spectacle, not the gold leaf on the meringue or the horse in the dining room, but the actual food. The terrapin made right. The lobster Newburg that reportedly silenced a table of people who talked for a living. The Roman punch arriving cold at exactly the moment you needed it most. Behind all the performance, behind all the social warfare conducted through silverware placement and finger bowl etiquette, there were people cooking with real skill and real knowledge and real care, night after night in hot kitchens that nobody visited, producing meals that people are still talking about 150 years later. That is worth something. Not the inequality that surrounded it, not the dog dinners or the gold-dusted cigarettes or the competitive extravagance that drove otherwise reasonable people to cover a Manhattan restaurant floor in sod for the purpose of a single evening's entertainment. But the cooking itself, the actual human craft of it, the understanding that a meal can be more than fuel, that sitting down together and eating something beautiful is one of the ways that people have always tried to say something to each other that ordinary language does not quite reach. The Gilded Age said it badly in many ways. It said it expensively and exclusively, and with a social cruelty that the finger bowl story tries to soften but cannot entirely conceal. It said it in ways that left most people outside the conversation entirely, eating 10-cent lunches at counters while the terrapin soup was being prepared 3 blocks away for people who would discuss the soup's provenance with the same attention that other people devoted to their children's futures. But it also said it with genuine passion and genuine skill and a belief, however misguided in its expression, that food mattered, that the table mattered, that the care you brought to what you served was a reflection of how seriously you took the people you were serving. That belief, stripped of the gold leaf and the horses and the $600 dog dinners, is not a bad belief. It is, in fact, a belief worth keeping. So tonight, as you drift off in your clean and comfortable surroundings, with no terrapin to sauce, and no 12 courses to pace yourself through, and no Ward McAllister deciding whether you belong on the list, maybe take a moment to think about the last meal that really mattered to you. Not the most expensive one, not the most elaborate one, the one where the food was right and the company was right and the evening did exactly what a good evening is supposed to do, which is make you feel, for a few hours, that the world is larger and warmer and more interesting than it seemed before you sat down. That feeling is what all those Gilded Age dinners were trying to produce, underneath everything else they were also doing. The terrapin and the champagne and the peacock and the Roman punch were all, at some level, in service of that feeling. They just got somewhat distracted along the way by the horses. History is full of people who wanted too much and took more than they should have and left the world a little more depleted for having passed through it. But it is also full of people who knew how to cook and how to set a table and how to make a Tuesday evening in 1890-something feel like something worth remembering 150 years later. The Gilded Age was both of those things at once, excessive and skillful, cruel and beautiful, ridiculous and in its best moments genuinely magnificent. Sleep well. You didn't have to eat on a horse to get here, and that, all things considered, is a luxury worth appreciating.